virtually, but by this time we all, I guess, are used to it. So I think it's 5:02. I'm gonna get started as if everyone is ready. My name is Joanne Corey, and I welcome all of you and thank the panelists for joining us as well to kick off the first meeting for the Shelter and Homeless Housing Roundtable. It's sort of a passion of all of us and probably some of the audience here. I got excited about this topic, and it piqued my interest when I worked in a again, design next to us was a shelter, and their timing of entering and exiting coincided with my schedule, early morning and evening. And all of a sudden I got interested in working on different typologies in architecture. I started to wonder if this is a different typology. So I'm very happy to welcome you all. And Sam, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm Samuel Maddox. I am co-chair for this roundtable. In the daytime and sometimes in the nighttime, I'm an adjunct faculty member at Wentworth Institute of Technology. They're in the architecture department. I also direct the Future Lab at Wentworth, and then I work at the BAC in the evenings also as a professor there. And have a home studio. My connection, just to sort of link myself to this just a bit, is that in my undergrad, I studied at a place called the Rural Studio in Hale County, Alabama, originally from Alabama, and worked on affordable, dignified, accessible rural housing there, working closely with policy as a tool to generate design. And it's kept me really interested and passionate in, serving those without housing ever since, one way or another. So I'm really glad to be a part of this. Thank you, Joanne, for including me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure working with you, Sam. And so this is just for everybody. It's a roundtable discussion. So we are not going to be talking a lot here. We will do a presentation. Our panelists will present themselves and their organizations and what they do. But then we want to give more time for the audience to engage with us and have a conversation as we move forward.
Shall we move forward?
Yep, please. So the few first slides is just to give an idea about the context and the lay of the land in terms of the topic. And here we're showing globally in terms of how much data has been collected on this. And very quickly, I'm going to go through these really fast. You see in the gray zones, that's where there is no data about homelessness and shelters. And then as the different colors and different levels, it depends on what kind of data is collected. So it's not necessarily there's more homeless people in this color or less. It's just data is all over the place. So that's a global perspective. And we move into national perspective. So this is the United States, and those numbers are showing in total how many homeless or unsheltered people. And please, when we're going to use a lot of terms in terms of shelter and homeless and no housing and so on and so forth, but it's all about providing shelter at the end of the day, regardless of the type of population, as we move through this presentation. And you hear a lot about different terminologies in that regard. So as you can see on the map, the darker colors where we have more homeless, unsheltered people. And then, and this is the data, this is live data. You can go on this website and click on each state and gives you all this information. And then next slide, it takes it to the different populations. So you have overall, and then individuals with families or children's, veterans, and so on and so forth. So that's also very helpful to have and find. And then next, you can zoom into each state. And then each counties within the states or in the map, and it's very live, also gives you data. So this is Massachusetts. It shows how many we have versus for 10,000 of people, we have 26 homeless, unsheltered people, total of 17,975 per night in 2020. And we quickly compared that, just to give a perspective, to California, which is has most challenges with sheltering people, and their numbers are much higher. So Again, that doesn't relate to the size of the states or the population of the states. It compares it 10,000 to 10,000. And next slide. Sam, you want to tell us a little bit about our mission here?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about the mission and the goal. I'd also like to say we don't have the links anywhere on that page. We can pop the links into the chat, I think, for those pages, those websites that Juan was talking about, where that you can work through the sort of the live dashboards to understand sort of what's going on across the country. Juan, if maybe you could find those links while I work our way through the mission and goal, if you don't mind.
Okay, or we can send it later on to the BSA and share it. I'll try to find it.
Sure, yeah. So I just want to sort of read through and talk to a little bit of this mission and goal. So the mission of this roundtable is to raise awareness to the issues and the obstacles encountered in the process of providing shelter to people experiencing displacement and homelessness. Point there being not just sort of chronic homelessness, but also sort of displaced peoples. We're interested in being quite expansive in that regard. Our goal is to create an engaging space for the aggregation of data, applied research, and personal narratives so that we as designers may be more prepared to act with compassion and understanding, whether that be directly through our work or through advocacy. So I think something important to me here is to point out that Juan and I, neither of us are necessarily experts here, but we are sort of your hosts in a way, I guess, to like create this space and fumble our way through some really wicked problems with you, and then bring the experts to the table so that we can all have the conversation. So in doing so, we hope to uncover and bring into focus the state, extent, and causes of homelessness, as well as the lack of shelter in the greater Boston area, with the eventual goal, not the initial goal, but the eventual goal of exploring solutions to the roots of these problems and empowering others to do the same. So we're not necessarily approaching this as a problem that we so hubristically think we can necessarily solve if we just apply ourselves enough, so much as we consider this to be a fact-finding expedition, a moment to drum up concern and advocacy, and to act not just professionally, but to act personally in this space and around these concerns. So we invite you to do that with us. The threshold to entry is low. So.
And as Sam mentioned, in the goal and the mission is we're looking at different aspects to this challenge of providing shelter. So not only an architectural solution to the problem, but more of understanding the problem from different angles and different lenses. We're looking at it. And this is how we are excited to have this panel with us of individuals and professionals from different areas that work with the city or private providers and also educational institutions. So to introduce them, we have Joyce Tavin. She's Senior Director of Policy and Program, Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance. And then we have David Thomas, Director of Permanent Housing and Clinical Services from Boston Public Health Commission. And Josh O'Brien, Senior Director of Emergency Shelters from Pine Street Inn. And then finally, Paolo Ciccarelli. Sorry, Paolo, if I'm... he's a professor and founder, director of Center for Design at Northeastern University. We're very excited to have you here. This is going to be a great discussion. So we can start with Joyce. Are you in the room? Okay.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I was thinking as you were all talking, I guess I can also share that I have a master's in urban planning from MIT. So I have particular interest in that, interconnection of urban planning, architecture, public policy, especially around an issue that I am very concerned about and care passionately about, and that is the ending of homelessness. I was going to start out and just share a little about the organization that I work for called the Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance, or MAHASA. And I think, Juan, you have the slides teed up?
I'm your man. Just tell me
Oh,
when
it's
to
Samuel.
advance. Yeah.
Sure. Next slide. Okay, so and we can go on to the next one. Our work. So what is MAHASA? So we are a statewide organization. We do public policy and advocacy work dedicated to the ending of homelessness in Massachusetts. Our particular area of focus is around unaccompanied adults who are experiencing long-term homelessness and also have disabling conditions. And in our world, often those folks are referred to as experiencing chronic homelessness. And may have very kind of long bouts in shelter or living outside. And our focus is how do we advance solutions to homelessness rooted in data and best practices. And among the practices that really have been proven over the last really couple of decades at this point are kind of permanent housing that gets bundled in with support services. And again, that's when you're talking about people who may have disabling conditions. This obviously doesn't apply to everyone. There are loads of people, homelessness at its core is an economic issue and an issue of scarcity of housing. So for many people, if we could simply provide this basic human need and right of sufficient affordable housing, they don't necessarily need something more sophisticated than that. But, our area of focus particularly is the folks kind of with more complicated conditions. Housing first is a term that's often used in our field, and it simply means that, like, you've got to start with housing. And when people have the stability and the dignity and the security that comes from having a place where you can close the door and it's your own, from there you can work on all the other issues. So in terms of terminology, while shelter, I guess, is the broad term, it's all about having some place to be. In our world, there's a very big demarcation between shelter as in an emergency response versus housing as in a permanent place where you can live. And to that end, we seek to reduce reliance on emergency responses and really get us to those solutions. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? First off, what we would call like traditional advocacy, which you may think about. It's like we work closely with state policymakers and legislators and in local communities and are doing advocacy work around funding and interventions to move us towards housing responses. We're also a little different from many organizations that do this kind of work in that we also do what we call advocacy through practice. We're actually the intermediary of funding that we try to get to organizations, including those that are joining us here today, Pine Street Inn and Boston Public Health Commission, to actually create permanent supportive housing and sustain that along with other examples. And then we do monitoring and evaluation and try to look at the data because that's so critical in trying to get decent data. I would be happy when we get into conversation to talk a little about the limitations in the data that we were looking at initially. That is kind of just giving us a snapshot of people on one night versus over time. So data is key. Collaboration and guidance. There's a lot of work we do one-on-one with our partner agencies, about 85 organizations across the state. Everything from during the pandemic, helping in parts of the state where they really had nothing, no shelter, growing encampments, how to connect them with funding and resources. For example, Leominster, using a motel as shelter while it was not being used, as a motel during the pandemic. And that kind of model was done as well in Boston, Western Mass, all over the state. So some of that kind of walking communities and partners through how do you create those resources, and then how do you create kind of housing as well. And next slide. So just highlighting just a few of the projects we've been involved in kind of on a long-term basis. The first two over on the left Home and Healthy for Good and Pay for Success. So these are both ways that in our intermediary role, we are getting funding, resources, technical assistance to provider agencies to launch and sustain housing with supports, what we call permanent supportive housing. And together, so first off, Home and Healthy for Good, that was the first statewide, what's called a Housing First initiative. Pay for Success was the first in the country using this sort of social innovation financing model that kind of brings in private financing. You prove certain outcomes like retention in housing, 85% of households retaining housing, and then public funding to pay back investors. In terms of critical impact, so one is over many years that we've been doing this with these two initiatives, able to prove through analysis of data that permanent supportive housing is less costly and more effective than managing health problems that people who may have complex mental illness and behavioral health challenges, managing those when people are living on the streets or in shelters. There's a little link to the Blue Cross Blue Shield funded study of this, where they really took mass health data, people with Medicaid records, compared that to homeless data, and then did a kind of cross comparison to people who were in these two housing programs, looking at more than 1,000 records, and saw that in fact, when people have the stability of housing, their need for emergency hospital visits and acute medical care drops. On average, costs drop by like roughly $5,600 a year per person. So that's one example. And all of these efforts have also led to Medicaid coverage for tenancy supports, because frankly, it is cheaper if we can support people in housing rather than having them going in and out of hospitals. And these two initiatives over a number of years in total have housed, more than 2,400 people. One thing I also wanted to mention over in the right-hand column, since it's something we've had architects very involved in, including Mark Margulies, who's been from Margulies and Peruzzi involved in the BSA. So A Place to Live is an initiative that is trying to scale up and promote innovative housing solutions that can be more cost effective, such as modular constructed housing. And we have been key in supporting and advancing two models of that are going to be happening in Worcester, one through the Housing Authority, the other through an organization called SMOC. And both of these will provide efficiency apartments for people who have previously been homeless. Again, much more cost effective than traditional stick-built housing. The overall project also is looking at issues of racial equity and looking at those not only in some of those targeted communities where modular construction is happening, but rather across the state, and kind of analysis of homelessness data, who is ending up homeless, and the issues of how do we get to better racial equity and who's getting access to housing and resources. So I will stop there, and happy later to have more of a conversation about data and the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Joyce.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for letting me be part of this conversation. My name is David Thomas. I work with the Homeless Services Bureau. We are one of 6 bureaus of the Boston Public Health Commission. And if you go to the next slide, actually the one after that, excuse me.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
The mission of the Boston Public Health Commission is to protect, promote, and preserve the health and well-being of all Boston residents, particularly the most vulnerable. That line is actually missing from this slide, I noticed. But the Homeless Bureau, and I'm sort of giving you a graph here, provides a comprehensive system of care that includes 2 municipal shelters, one for men, one for women, a Housing First division, that includes housing search and stabilization, which means stabilization means community-based case management, home visiting, and support for people when they move to their own homes, workforce development and rehabilitation services. This graph, I deliberately enlarged the circle in the middle. We're defining clinical services really as assessment of people, understanding where people are coming from. We have people from so many different communities, states, and parts of Boston that we really want to try to understand when they come in, where they're coming from, what their primary issues are. We're doing the clinical services include that intake and assessment, referral, and also crisis intervention at the front door. And you can see that the arrows are one way from the left part of the slide, the emergency shelter entrance to clinical services, and then a straight line to the Housing First programs. As Joyce mentioned, Housing First is a paradigm that includes both a direct avenue to housing, regardless of how long people are homeless, and regardless of what their behavioral health or maybe barriers to housing may be, prior evictions, criminal history, and so forth, as well as behavioral health challenges, a direct path to housing, but that also includes support services. The clinical services that we provide at the door are designed to help people connect immediately to the services that they need, which will then follow them into housing. So the support services are really critical to the Housing First, to the success of Housing First, as well as access. We have a number of access to housing, I should say, and that's actually one of the two things that is probably the bigger challenge, is access to housing. So we'll talk more about that. I'm not going to describe all of the different Housing First programs we have, but they're in that bubble there, on below on the right. Workforce development is a two-way arrow. Our intake, our clinicians and case managers at the front door refer people for on-site job readiness programs, employment within the shelters. We have a kitchen where we employ people in culinary arts training, and they prepare food. And then that department refers back for support as people are working in the shelter and may have challenges. The double line below that talks about rehabilitation and services is specifically about a couple of detoxes and post-detox programs that our agency runs. I'm going to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the two municipal shelters, one is Southampton Street for men. We have 437 male beds and with 50 to 90 overflow beds, meaning that we can accommodate an additional, more beds than 437 when it's very cold or the weather is inclement, or hot for that matter. And then Woods Mullen Shelter for women, which is 222 female beds. We have, as well as 40 beds of overflow. We have a number of on-site providers that are other agencies that are listed on the right. And also our shelter offers on-site medical clinics that are run by Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program. We can go to the next slide. Actually, we'll skip this slide. Excuse me, Samuel, for time. Our front door triage department is part of this clinical services circle that you saw. This is a program that's been in place within the Boston shelter system for about 5 years. It's anyone new to our shelters goes through a very thorough assessment of where they're coming from and whether they can return to those places, including other communities, families, and so forth. So that's an important initiative. About 35% of people who come into our shelters self-resolve, meaning that they leave within a week. So of the 6,000 people we see every year, 35% leave within a week. So homelessness is both a transient issue, but also can be a very chronic issue for many people as well. We can go to the next slide. This is just a description of our workforce development programs. We run a kitchen at on Quincy Street near in Dorchester, where food is prepared and then brought to the shelters, and that employs a lot of clients, as I mentioned earlier. Go to the next slide. Serving ourselves career center, we have on-site GED preparedness classes and other on-the-job training support services for people so that they can become employed after they work for us. And we have a very high employment placement rate. Many people work for restaurants and so forth after they leave the shelter. Go to the next slide. And Housing First, again, we've placed about 850 people since 2009 through our Housing First programs. We provide stabilization, as I mentioned, that's the critical component, the community-based services, with about a 90% tenancy retention rate for those people, 850 people, meaning that they've remained in housing during that time. Next slide. And this program was HUES, or High Utilizers of Emergency Services, is a program that we ran actually with Mahasa, started with Mahasa about 10 years ago. This is for people who were essentially living in the emergency rooms and on the streets of Boston. And we piloted this program to provide direct access to housing with intensive supports. And those people were actually not regular shelter stayers. But over a period of 10 years, we had about a 75% retention rate for people who were, despite the fact that they had tremendous behavioral health issues, 54% reduction in emergency room visits, and 31% reduction in inpatient admissions. That's just one of the sort of these are just statistics that are important to point out, that Housing First can work for people even who are very challenged. The next slide. Thank you. And then we run several community permanent housing programs in the community that where people are living, we own these properties along with the Friends of Boston Homeless program, which is a 501c3 agency that partners with us to do fundraising and property management. So I think that is the end of my slides.
Thank you, David. That's a lot. And I know today there is a lot we're throwing at everyone, a lot of information, but the hope with this roundtable in the future to bring each profession or each organization back and take a deeper dive into the topic. So we have 2 more presenters to go and 10 minutes to go, so we can open it for discussion with the audience. Josh, do you want to go next to Pine Street?
Thank you so much. So again, my name is Josh with the Pine Street Inn. It's one of the region's largest providers of services for homeless individuals, and just recognized our 50th year last year. And I'm particularly excited today to talk with you and have some dialogue. Being in the shelters, literally working in the shelters pretty much every day for the last 25 years at different sites, I've seen the impact your work has on how we operate every day, the layout, features, colors, textures, flow, everything that you do to make things better for our guests. When we partner together, we really appreciate that. And the first shelter I started in was off the campus of MIT with the Caspar shelter in Cambridge. And that was built from the ground up, designed specifically to be a shelter. And since then, I've worked mostly in facilities that would be the last place you would think of to place a shelter if you were really intending to have a great and respectful place for guests. So we've partnered over the years with some of you, and currently working with Kitty, who's on the call, to reimagine our Women's Inn here at Pine Street. And that project is ongoing, and it's going to be wonderful when it's done. So I'm excited to talk with you. I work in the shelters, so I'm going to be a little more shelter specific. Pine Street operates 5 shelters currently, 2 in the South End, our Women's Inn and Men's Inn. I'm at our Men's Inn right now. We have our Holy Family Inn, which is in Dorchester. We have our Shattuck shelter in Jamaica Plain, and we have a temporary shelter out in Brighton at the Charles River Inn. If you're familiar with that area, it's right in between the IHOP and the McDonald's out in that area. And that was opened after we closed the temporary shelter at 891 Mass Ave, the old Best Western Roundhouse near the corner of Milnia Cass and Mass Ave, to try and depopulate the shelters a bit and create some social distancing. Pine Street also offers 24/7 street outreach throughout the city of Boston, behavioral health, and comprehensive housing and supportive services, much of what complementary and working closely with David's teams at the Health Commission. Our two focuses right now at Pine Street, one that is closest to me, it's really reimagining shelter, and it's some of the work we're doing with Kitty just in the physical space at our Women's Inn, but just across the shelters, focusing on our community commitment to have shelter become rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. And as David said, focusing on that triage and assessment before someone even arrives in shelter. It can be easy to get stuck in shelter once you're here. And so if we can resolve, as David said, a third or more of folks from ever having to come into the shelter in advance, that is the best solution. But if folks do come in, rapid connection to housing and support services, whether they're in the shelter or working with our street outreach teams on the street, as the quickest pathway to whatever someone's pathway is to safe, affordable, sustainable housing, with or without supports, as Joyce talked about earlier. And second is really accelerating Pine Street's housing options for guests. Currently, as you see on the slide, we're operating about 850 units of housing that will crest over 1,000 shortly, with new projects with over 250 units coming on board in Jamaica Plain and on Clarendon Street shortly. So in our shelters, we have about 100 team members just focused, that I work with most closely, just focused on assisting our guests, staying safe and connected. I don't know if anybody's familiar. I'm from Maine. I actually live in Maine and commute from Maine. I used to work for the city of Portland in their shelter system. And if you ever go up to LL Bean in Freeport, you'll notice they never have locks on the doors because they never close. So I think our shelters are very similar to that. We really don't need locks on the doors because we're open 24 hours a day, every day of the week, rain, sleet, snow, to support our guests. So we have about 100 team members just focused on supporting our guests, called guest services specialists, and they work on the front lines in all of our shelters. Real quick, just on COVID, I thought you might be interested. As we all faced our individual and collective hardships with COVID, we were running between 30 and 40% of our guests when we started wide testing were testing positive for COVID. With the depopulation of the shelters, finding creative solutions, opening up extra hotel sites, we've been able to still testing every other week. At Pine Street shelters, we're going over 6 months now without a positive test. So we've really been able to show that if we can create the space and privacy and flexibility and health education for staff and guests, we can really be successful in public health outcomes. Some of the things we also did, we removed all of our bunk beds, created plexiglass dividers, and of course created 6 feet of social distancing between all the beds. And we're this week installing new, very high-tech UV lighting as well. And super quick, just on the issues going on in the news currently with Massachusetts Ave and Melnia Cass. As some of you may have seen, it's just a terribly difficult issue, and so much concern with the folks that are living and staying in that area, in tents or on the street or just frequenting that area. Our outreach teams are working with about 30 individuals from that area, and Pine Street is really advocating for long-term, a regional approach to the inadequacies of the system. But in the short term, we're just laser focused on supporting each individual person and hoping that all solutions will be looked at, including the recovery beds offered by Sheriff Tompkins and hopefully reopening the Long Island Bridge at some point in the future. So I'll stop there, but really look forward to a dialogue. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting to learn. It's a lot of work getting done. Paolo, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I cannot share what other participants are sharing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let me stop my sharing. There you are.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Perfectly, yeah.
I'm Paolo Ciccarelli. I'm a professor of design at Northeastern University, where I founded the Center for Design 2 years ago, more or less. And the Center for Design is an interdisciplinary research center, and we focus on many different intersections between design and other disciplines. So computer science, architecture, journalism, health, robotics, policy, law, whatever. There is an entire group of faculty working on really using design to tackle very complex problems, and we cannot do that alone as a discipline. So we partner, we many others. But what really crosses all of these bridges is data, and that's one of the major research lines that we have at the center. And going back to the subtitle of my slides, we try really to transform data in a way that they make sense, that they can make an impact. So I heard a lot here talking about data, and so I have a few questions for you that we may discuss during the time for discussion later. So the first question would be, are we sure we have the right data? We are taking the right data into consideration. We're observing this phenomenon we are talking about. So shelters and homelessness, is the statistical data or the demographic data that we usually work with the right data to observe? Or is there anything else that we can use, for example, what we call unstructured data, like the discourses around this problem? Scraping, for example, web data from blogs and conversation around the topic might be interesting. Or what about pictures or even movies that depict the phenomenon in a certain way, that frame the phenomenon in a certain way that may impact certainly the perception, but also the action in that area? The second question would be how we build data or how data are built. And this may lead to new ways of collecting data, new ways of capturing the phenomena that are neither the statistical data we were talking about before, nor the unstructured data that we may collect on the web. We may co-design data. We may have people participating in building data, as it happened in Haiti in 2010. Literally right after the earthquake happened, a bunch of volunteers really ran across the city, building the map that they didn't have to rescue the people after the earthquake. So the Google map was very poor in Haiti in 2010. So they went across the city with sensors, GPS sensors, and they collected data that were needed in order to create the map for the people rescuing the people. That's just an example. There are many ways to build actually the data sets that we don't have, and involving people doing that in the context and having volunteers or even the people involved in the phenomenon creating the data for observing it. And third question is what is the best way to represent, to share and communicate the data that we have? Are we sure again that the traditional charts and the dashboards that we usually use are the only way to do that? I give you a couple of examples of projects done by colleagues at Northeastern. This is actually, it may look like an art piece, an art installation, a land art piece. Actually, it is probably land art, but it's also a representation of the amount of plastic that we can find in the ocean. So if you look closely to that sculpture, gigantic sculpture in Bali, it's made out of the plastic that has been collected in the ocean. So again, the phenomenon itself is in a way representing itself in the context through pieces of the phenomenon. That's an example of a different way to collect and represent data that may be useful. And that's another experiment done by Laura Perovich that recently joined Northeastern from MIT. And she's doing a lot of activities with citizens, involving them not only in the collection of data, but also in performing actions that really try to raise awareness on the phenomenon. So in that case, they collected data about the pollution on the Charles River and the actors of that pollution, and then released on collectively these lanterns that were representing the data set on the river in an event that was a visualization, a performance, a collective act. So these are the questions that I wanted to bring up for the conversation, and happy to be part of it in a minute, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pablo.
Thank you, Paulo.
So with that, we can begin our conversation. And I think in the spirit of the roundtable conversation, it's really appropriate not to have any screen sharing going on, right? We're just looking one another in the eye, just pure vis-a-vis like it would be at a round table. So we'd love to take questions for our guests, for our panelists from the audience, or audience is not even the right word, but we'd love to take some questions, or also just hear some of the crossfire between y'all after hearing the way that you're working. There's so many points of connection, I'm sure, that you're curious about yourselves.
Hi, I can share my screen. I'm actually a student at Wentworth with Sam, so it's great to be here. I'm currently doing my thesis on homelessness, so this is a fantastic conversation to be having. And I was wondering if there's been any thought, or if there could be a conversation about how the latest developments and how we approach the LGBT community and how we are developing a newer approach to architecture, like all gender bathrooms, and how that might be applied to the way we approach shelters and emergency housing for the homeless as well.
Thanks so much, Alexandra.
That seems like a question, two-part question for Joyce and for Josh, maybe. But I'll let the panelists feel free to answer to any part of the question. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, it is a great question, Joyce. If you don't mind, I'll jump in. It's something we've really been exploring a lot at Pine Street, going back a number of years. I think particularly 6 or 7 years ago, we started on an internal process to do an assessment of access to the shelter and all of our programs, but for my part was more specific to the shelter, and looking at how we can do a much better job of providing equal and open and welcoming access, no matter how someone identifies. Our larger shelters have always, well, not always, but many of them have the large congregate bathrooms, not just the big dorms with hundreds of people in them, but large non-private bathrooms and showers, and not appropriate to give individuals the right level of privacy and comfort that they may or may not want. So we've been working on that for a number of years, and changed our policies many years ago so that any guest, at least for Pine Street, guests can select the shelter that they most feel comfortable entering, regardless of gender identity. So, we have some work to do internally at Pine Street with some of our naming. We have one shelter called the Men's Inn, one shelter called the Women's Inn, and we're working to change that because that can be just not welcoming to begin with. But guests can seek shelter at the Men's Inn, for example, regardless of how they identify individually. We also want to create more pod-like structures, so there's more flexibility within the space, more private bathrooms or gender-neutral bathrooms, and have more our guest involvement and folks with lived experience to help inform us on how we can update our approaches.
So I will add to that, because this is a real issue. We know that many people who will not go to shelter, they are LGBTQ, they may be non-binary, they're just not comfortable or feel safe in congregate shelters. It's one of the reasons that we advocate so strongly for learning from this experience of the pandemic and getting away as much as possible from large mass congregate shelter. I mean, my fellow panelists, they are within their organizations doing absolutely everything they can to transform those physical spaces and policies. But again, points to, if we can get to settings when we say non-congregate, like where you have your own room and can close the door, that removes a lot of these issues, and as much as possible, creating pathways to housing. So that going to a shelter is, ideally not happening or as rare as possible. Mm-hmm. But getting to non-congregate settings is one of the ways. And I will just share, there are once more of those kinds of settings were made available during the pandemic, people were coming inside who previously would not go to shelters. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I have a question, and maybe it's a softball for Josh, but it's something I'm curious about. In Pine Street in the Men's Inn, of course, the building wasn't intended for shelter, right? It was a fire station and other things, and kind of a big warehouse sort of space. And I wonder about, when you think of reimagining shelter and maybe making, smaller scale pods and so on, how do you deal with the pressure of the numbers at the same time? Is that more about dispersing people to other sites, or because I imagine the numbers are still there? So how does that work for you?
Yeah, it's something thanks, Kitty. We're really worried about as we head into the winter, because we've created some extra space in non-congregate settings, but not enough that would typically meet the winter demand. And it's a bit of an unknown what that demand will be like, although we know the numbers of folks unsheltered right now in the city are up and increased steadily over the summer and heading into this winter. So yeah, we would love to take an all the above approach to see how we can continue to create better spacing within our existing structures. For example, just taking away we took away all of our bunk beds and create a much better sense of space and air, and creating some additional areas for privacy, even within our congregate settings, has made a huge difference. And we found that actually allows for quicker and better outcomes, more trust, more communication between guests and the staff members who are working to support folks in their housing pathway. And so I think if we can provide the right environment, the housing pathways will move more quickly, there'll be better engagement, and that is a great strategy. Then keep the numbers down of those needing or seeking or staying longer. We can reduce lengths of stay. There's a lot of folks, as I think Dave mentioned earlier, they're coming and going pretty quickly, but then there's a whole group, as Joyce mentioned earlier, of folks who are chronic and staying a long time and taking up a lot of bed space. So, so yeah, we're definitely concerned about that for this winter, but hope that the more personalized approach through COVID has resulted in, we've seen resulted in better outcomes when we're able to focus more one-on-one.
Mhm.
Thank you.
I see we have a question in the chat from Ivy Lee. Ivy, would you like to ask it yourself, or I'm happy to read it for you? No.
Yeah, sure. I can ask it. I apologize. I'm in the car right now, but basically I'm one of the co-founders for an architecture club at my high school, and we were looking for projects or ways we could get involved with community. And I found this roundtable discussion, and I thought it would be interesting to hear about. And also I was wondering if there were any projects or opportunities or organizations that the club could participate in that would actually help this issue.
I love that question. Thank you, Ivy.
Again, any of our panelists who have experiences with schools or institutions, I know there's a lot to talk about here, but this is maybe a way of maybe mentioning that. And I know this roundtable it will be engaging students and clubs, and as we move forward with our mission, which could evolve as well. So, but please do share with us, David.
Sure, I'm happy to comment if that's okay. The Homeless Bureau has we have a volunteer services department, and we do have volunteers, clubs, or groups of people, individual people coming from all over the city to engage in events, but also sometimes there can be projects within the shelters that are helpful, all variety of things. Many of the events, I'm talking about holiday events sometimes, but also, we had recently had some volunteers help us make some signs that was to make the description of our services a little bit more engaging. So there's just a variety of things. I'm happy to share contact information for the volunteer services coordinator. We also have, as I mentioned before, we work closely with a nonprofit called Friends of Boston Homeless, which is we're a public agency, and they are a private agency that helps raise funding. They have some volunteer opportunities as well that help us. So happy to share more about that.
And Ivy, if you have any ideas, if your club is interested of new ideas or different ways, please don't hesitate to approach myself or Sam to carry on the conversation.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question, a kind of broad sort of way to launch into some other conversations. So we've talked about a bit about sort of COVID as a force acting on this space and on the people who are experiencing homelessness right now. And I understand, you know, as we've got the nor'easter coming in, you know, there's other environmental concerns that push puts a pressure on the system at a time. But in an even larger way, you know, I'm following all the news of questions of, you know, whatever, 4% inflation, and the great resignation is what is now called this moment of people walking away from work and sort of, you know, protesting against the conditions of their labor. In the midst of the pandemic, I'm curious sort of if you could reflect on when and how you've seen some of these larger movements really affect any sort of fluctuation within our state, within our city in terms of homelessness, or if you're seeing anything or concerned about anything right now in a larger sort of economic sense as well. Kind of a hard question. It's not, it's a big one.
It is a big one. You know, some of the housing market concerns that we have in Boston are not just housing market, but Boston is an interesting, you know, mixture of you know, thriving community with a lot of healthcare services, for example, and a very expensive housing market. And we tend to, you know, our homeless population tends to have a lot of, you know, medical issues that are because we're so close to, you know, every hospital in practically every corner, but then a very expensive housing market. So it tends to be, you know, there's really a paradox in terms of the way that some services or opportunities are very robust and others are very narrow. And I think also that we are the, you know, transportation hub for all of New England and so forth. So we get a lot of transients from all over the place. So I think I hope I'm addressing what you asked, but I think it's kind of a, you know, I'm not sure if I addressed what your question was, Sam, but I hope I did.
I think so. I mean, another big pressure that I'll just toss in is you know, the intersection of aging with homelessness. And I'm thinking specifically, and again, in thinking in this big way, I'm thinking about the Build Back Better bill that right now is being hotly debated, and expansion. I believe it has expansion of Medicare, you know, and services therein involved. And I know that we're sort of also facing an aging bubble in the next, you know, decade or a few. And I'm curious how are we preparing for that? Is there fear of a spike in aged homeless folks, people experiencing homelessness in their golden years?
If I could just jump in, and Josh, you may have other things you want to add. I think one of the things to keep in mind is all of these changes in demographics and public policy, they absolutely have an impact on who is homeless and the numbers of people. But the tricky part is it doesn't always happen overnight. You know, it doesn't mean like the eviction moratorium is lifted and the next day there are thousands of people coming in, flowing into shelter. Or, you know, back in the 70s, we start to close mental health backward hospitals, and the next day everyone's out on the streets. But rather what happens is that over time, people's whatever social family networks they have that they depend on may slowly erode. And then it's often like quietly it's happening. And lo and behold, years later, you turn around and what is it we used to say? You know, Pine Street Inn is the largest mental health institution in the state. Or, you know, similarly, we're seeing this this rise in people who are elderly with, significant health issues who are homeless and in shelters. So I'd say that's a key thing to keep in mind, but absolutely all of it, all of these policy issues affect homelessness because frankly, the term homelessness, I mean, I'm old enough to remember a time when we didn't even use this term. What is it? It's really the people who are the most vulnerable end up on the bottom and result being there as a result of all of these other system failures, right?
Mhm.
Poverty, breakdowns in our criminal justice system, our mental health system, our substance abuse treatment system.
Mhm.
It's all of it, and we just label it homelessness.
That's powerful. It's really
Yeah.
Well
powerful.
said. Yep.
So that's, I think Joyce just brought it all together. So the shelter challenge and problem is not just because we don't have enough housing. Housing is a band-aid to a solution, which is a great solution in a good way, but it does not help to kind of reduce and eliminate the problems, especially when we have catastrophic things happening like COVID or any other natural disasters. It just gets worse and worse. And on a softer note, I'm also interested in community building and community network of the populations who don't have shelters. Does any of the panelists know if there is such a thing amongst this population, and are there any efforts as we bring them together and find housing for them? Is there any way of also creating communities for them and build that social network that Joyce, you talked about, that sort of gets reduced as you get older and then you have nothing? Is how do we give it back? Because this is really, as a human being, we survive on that, we thrive on that. And I'll stop there.
I have two comments also in the chat that relate to what you're saying, Chuan. So in the spirit of the kind of conversational side, I want to toss them out before.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So Greta Eckhart says, I live in Waltham and through my church have had conversations with some of the local service providers for the unhoused population. One thing they all mentioned is that the need for a feeling of community among their clients. Do our panelists have any thoughts on this? And then I saw that Alexandra, you responded, I agree with Greta, and I'm wondering if framing the situation less like a segregated group of people facing an issue, we look at it in terms of our neighbors who need help to create a sense of unity in the community.
Yeah.
So yeah, very related to what you're
Very
saying, Chuan.
Yep.
Joyce and Josh may have more to say on this. I wanted to, I know we're in limited time, but Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation, and I can put this in the chat. It's we've worked with them a long time on low threshold housing for very chronically homeless folks. They're working with a couple of an architect and other community groups to create congregate housing that has more green space, and also activities within that space that are really creating a lot of community. Because I think, so anyway, without taking up too much time, I recommend looking at their website, Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation. And then, one of the things about that this connects to architecture, I think, is that Boston has such a, old housing stock and a very sort of, there isn't many of the housing, the less expensive housing that we're placing people is not designed often for community, and it tends to be sort of segregating and isolating. So I think it really is a challenge for architects and community developers to look at space, which is very limited in Boston also, not to mention the state, other communities. So anyway, I think that's a really interesting question.
I love folding in accessibility in terms of building community into that. I had not been thinking about sort of accessibility to sort of facilitating a sense of community. Josh Safdie had also commented on the inaccessibility in the housing stock in Boston, aging and disability, but I'm just really fascinated by also thinking about it as social relationships, right? Not just sort of physical movement or what have you, or sort of safety for someone who may be more advanced in age.
And we see in
So
those social relations, oh, I'm so sorry. I was going to say, in those social relationships, we see many of our guests who are housed. If we don't do a good job connecting them right away with that sense of community, they're coming back to play dominoes or visit with friends, and you can just see in that moment, that we miss something in that connectivity to the social, the needs we all have to be social and part of that community in whatever way that is important to us.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was going to say it's past 6 o'clock. We can continue talking, whoever would like to stay longer. But officially, we're running out of time, although we were told this Zoom can continue forever. Not necessarily we're going to continue forever, but we look forward for future conversations. And Sam, I know you had the slides for our wrap up, but please don't hesitate to contact any of us with any new ideas or topics you would like to discuss. Some of them you'll see here on the screen. We call them breadcrumbs.
Yeah. We like to think that at the end of one meeting, we leave a trail to the next meeting through our conversation and through the contributions of our panelists and through the contributions of everyone at the table. But some thoughts in advance that we've been thinking about, questions really we've been asking to guide our steps forward is, among many, how can behavioral health services work as preventative care in these spaces? What about homelessness in ex-urban context? That one's particularly interesting to me as someone from a rural southern space who's worked in housing in such spaces as well. What types of data should we be collecting to better define our challenges? Paolo, you were really touching on this in a fascinating way, and it was wonderful to see the visualization. So you're in the DNA now of our roundtable for sure. How does policing intersect with homelessness? Questions of the past 18 months plus, really, and how we start to think about what is the force that police exert on these spaces, or what is the kind of services that people need in those kinds of emergencies in situations of homelessness? How can we fold in emerging tech to ask more questions, to find more solutions? How can artists meaningfully and impactfully work in this space? And are there pre-existing information and resource sharing networks among those living homeless? What is not just coming hubristically with answers from outside and without glamorizing or sort of or doing the kind of sort of voyeuristic disservice of looking at people living in a type of crisis. How can we also accept that and recognize that there's so much to learn and there's so much resilience already in this space? How do we come as students as well as advocates? So these are the things that are inspiring us as we move forward. And I'm happy we would love to add more questions to this, or also, if anyone wants to touch on these, it's all welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. And thank you to our panelists for your time and for your interest in this. And hopefully you'll come back and join us with maybe projects, initiatives, ideas, thoughts, and so on. And thank you for our audience for your time. And we'd love to hear more from you as we continue this roundtable. I think this is the end of it. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You're
Bye.
welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Can we stay on if we want to stay on?
Yeah, hang out. Hang out with us.
Yes, this was great. Thank you. As I muddle through my own thesis on this topic, it's always great to get some outside feedback and on some ideas that I've been working on. So
Will you share a little bit, just
yeah,
while you have the floor?
sure. And with all handful of us left. So I am a graduate student at Wentworth of in architecture, and I am approaching the issue of homelessness in our community. And I've chosen to work in the local Roxbury area. And I am proposing a temporary housing, like emergency housing solution that will work in kind of a pod format with a shared community amenity building to kind of build upon what we had discussed already here. It was that a need for security and dignity and visibility. And rapidly addressing the solution, while this would not be a permanent solution I'm proposing, it would kind of build a foundation for the lifestyle that we would be proposing for these people. But I'm still at the very foundation of this project. I have not gotten very far into it, so any and all comments or just any participation that could be made would be very helpful. It has been quite the interesting few weeks, 2 months into a start of my program, but it's great to be here. Thank you.
I'm just curious, does your pod concept include a bathroom?
Currently it does not, but I am planning on designing the amenities in my shared complex to be designed like the all gender bathrooms that are coming to fruition in many spaces these days, where each unit is a lockable unit, and there's no like mass showering or bathroom areas.
So but from the living unit, you would go to another unit to use a bathroom?
Yes, because of the way that this emergency shelter would be put up, it would not be possible to have plumbing connections to each of the living pods. That would have to be amassed into one shared larger space. But yeah, that's essentially, there is the issue of creating still how to create a safe connection from the pods to these shared spaces. So I'm definitely keeping that in mind.
So just so you're aware, there are a couple of companies. One of them might even be called Pod or something, and maybe you've done the research, that especially during COVID, they've been pushing these examples of kind of pod-like structures. They bring them into areas, other parts of the country where there's a lot of open space or big parking lot. In fact, it was even proposed here, like take a back parking lot at one of the public state universities and put up pods. Just be aware there's pushback about that, because it's still back to the shared bathrooms. And in this part of the country, does that mean you have to go outside to get to a bathroom?
Yeah. As I look outside, that seems rough right now.
Yeah. But so it's worth looking at those companies that are using this model elsewhere. I realize, the plumbing, that's a big issue, big expense. Some of those models maybe have worked better in more temperate climates.
I think about dignity as you were talking about it earlier, Joyce, and it's something that was really a huge part of the work at Rural Studio, whether it was housing or what have you. The idea that it's not just about provision of shelter, but it really is that sense of safety. And there's all these cultural layers, and there's all these very subtle experiences that we don't even really kind of consider until they're gone, right? And I think of the idea of the bathroom and the wash space as something that it feels like just the provision of it is like kind of a checkbox. But when I really start to think about like what is dignity in the use of a bathroom and a restroom facility, and whether or not it's conspicuous that you are using the restroom because it's something about moving outside, because it's the kind of, you know, like fair version of sort of wall of bathrooms or whatever you have there. I think it's a really interesting question, not just to ask the logistical, but also those really cultural and really also kind of individual, the way culture and society, it reflects on us individually, and we feel that sense of self and dignity in how we approach that space as such a personal space, and how public it feels. So just want to throw that out there.
We have tried to get a place in Lynn to get RVs that are now, you know, less often in demand since it's starting to be winter. And unfortunately, it's been trying for a couple of years, and the city of Lynn doesn't really want to have people who don't make a regular income. They feel like they have already too many people with need. But I think that is a possible solution, maybe in another place, because that allows you to have, you know, pretty much an independent life, and it allows you to feel safe. You have your own space. And you don't need to every night find a new place to go to for sleeping. And so it frees you up to actually, you know, start having a regular life and have possibility of learning or even finding jobs and so on. And I mean, it's so unbelievable that in our society, we have people living on the street. There is in Berkeley, California, they tried the following. They have an old warehouse that's empty, and they actually put tents inside the warehouse to have people sleep there. There's an architect friend of mine who is also part of the board of architects, designers, and planners for social responsibility. He actually figured out how to do this with code approval, building department approval. So, because once it's in a, you know, in a structure, you have to be much more aware of the potential safety issues.
Oh, sorry, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
First off, I do have to jump in and say hello to my neighbor, Patrick Couliback.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, if I may also jump in and, you know, just that the visuals of tents within a warehouse. I don't know, you know, what is it? 2/3 of people experiencing homelessness in California are unsheltered.
Yeah.
You know, are we not still the richest country in the world or near richest? It's
Yeah,
just
for whom?
frightening how we normalize this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think you were talking about RVs. So I was thinking, what was it? The movie Nomadland. And so I then read the book about it, and it's very interesting, this growth of people, especially out west, who are living in their RVs.
Yeah.
And it's true, it's a whole lot better sense of control and dignity than having to go to a shelter, but it's still kind of frightening what's becoming, you know, the limited options people have.
Yeah.
And is it also, as housing gets more and more scarce and, you know, inaccessible, yeah, people are living in tents and RVs.
It's such a huge problem. I just don't see any quick solution, or like it seems like it's forever being pushed to the side.
Yeah.
And I think it may be partially a cultural problem, because everyone is so focused on their own family, and there is so much less security than in other places in the industrialized world, that I can understand why people are so much more focused on their own survival. But
Well, it's also, I mean, we simply will not invest in housing as a basic human right.
yeah,
Or
Right? I
call
mean,
it that. Yeah.
yeah, if we, and, and I guess you all who are the architects know better, but there's also the irony, as we have raised the standards of housing quality, but then we add so much complexity to the zoning and permitting and to everything and make it so complex, it becomes
Yeah.
so expensive to create housing. I mean, I don't think it needs to be as expensive, but we also have to rethink our priorities.
As well as to consider that the zoning has been kind of modified and developed in a way that limits the capabilities of small affordable housing.
Right.
It's kind of ruled out the single room occupancy kind of model that used to be more effective in terms of giving people an option for being housed when they were on low income. I know a lot of my thesis has worked on studying tiny houses, and they're as they are a solution to homelessness. But zoning for that solution has been such an issue in so many places across the country, because the zoning a lot of governments don't want small auxiliary dwellings on properties.
Are you in part talking about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, as well?
ADUs, SROs, tiny houses, all of those sort of smaller kind of dwellings that are not necessarily considered homes to many people in this country.
It drives me bonkers, the fight against ADUs, because this idea of like aggregating wealth and then aggregating capital and then aggregating a lack of capital because we refuse to like not blend in housing, right? Everything has to be like a block of a kind of development of affordable or incredibly unaffordable housing, like drives me mad. As the part of me that like, hung out with planners a lot in grad school, like, and was always interested in the spatial components of these things.
Or we prohibit 4 or more unrelated people from living in housing.
Wait, is that a thing here?
Absolutely, it is. I mean, of course, you probably know loads of people who are roommates together. But if you're a nonprofit organization, and you've got to go by the books, most cities and towns in Massachusetts have these regulations. It was their way of getting rid of rooming houses. 4 or more unrelated people cannot live together. Right. So it's crazy.
And if you even consider the way this news is briefly discussed on the mass and task issue, the way that the sheriff responded was, I believe, in terms of, well, it was already illegal for them to be there, so we're dealing with it because of that. I mean, obviously the nor'easter is coming and they're trying to house these people, but they were like, well, it was already illegal. Well, it's like, well, that clearly isn't the main issue here. Like, that's not clearly the main framing we want to give this is not, well, we're policing, we're coming down on legal issues. We should be coming down on the humanitarian issue. And that should have been the main focus of the main push and backing to why they were finally getting some response together.
Yeah, it's really hard though, because you also get pushback from every community, right? No one wants this. I mean, you've got Mass and Cass, you got 150 people camped out, and then within that area, there's the Best Western former hotel. It's empty, and it cannot be used, because it was, Pine Street was using it for a little while for not what we call non-congregate shelter, and then I understand the community around there is pushing back. They're saying everything's right. We're, in these neighborhoods. But yeah, in the meantime, you've got these empty spaces.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, the effort to use a hotel in Revere was maybe poorly handled, and everyone says, like, not here, not in my community.
and I mean, it's also an issue that it's not shared.
Yeah.
This is something the whole society should be addressing, not just certain sections of the society. It's also not fair. If everybody had to participate, it would be a different.
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize. I do need to step off.
Do not apologize.
I'm enjoying the
Please.
conversation.
Thank you for sticking it out and hanging out with us a bit longer.
Sure.
And I apologize because I left thinking it was over. And then I'm like, wait a minute, it's not over. I'm coming back. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you.
I'll say hi to Joanne. I haven't seen you in years.
Patrick?
We used to work back at Rothman.
Yeah?
I remember back then. I don't want to say how long it is because neither of us is actually that old.
Patrick, where are you now?
I have been working on my own for a number of years, but what is interesting is that I'm attending here tonight. Well, for a number of reasons, because I saw you were presenting, because I saw Joyce was presenting, although I can look out my back window and see Joyce anytime I want. Over the last couple of years, I've picked up a certificate in data analytics from Northeastern and attended an online class at MIT's School of Architecture and Planning on data science and real estate. That's kind of got my head going here. And I'd love to get back into architecture as somebody with domain knowledge, but primarily doing the data work. And I'm not sure exactly how that exists. Is it space planning? Is it?
Yeah.
Well, something else? I don't know.
There is, well,
and we could talk about this.
Man, that's a long time ago. I'm trying to not remember. It's nice to see you. There is a lot on data, and that's why we brought Paulo.
I'll reach out to him.
We've noticed the past few months as we're all of us looking at this, there's so much data, but different kind of data, and everybody collecting data, they collect it differently. So when you're looking at a graph or a map, it's not just by reading the colors you get it, because you don't know how they decided how to do the data. I mean, Joyce was just telling us some of the numbers in Massachusetts are high because they're counting families and children.
Right.
Versus in other states.
So easily.
I'm sorry?
Data lies so easily.
Yeah.
Right?
In other states, it's illegal to calculate to add children or something like in that source. I don't know the details.
Families aren't considered aren't sheltered. They do not accept families into shelters in other states, and they do in Massachusetts. So the idea was there's a lot of couch surfing that's like unidentified, almost like informal or homelessness or like pseudo homelessness that would otherwise be like on the street and thus in a shelter and reported. But it's the refusal of families in other locations. That's what that. Sorry, just to like deliver the detail.
So also part of our involvement with Mahasa is to figure out also what kind of data they have, and how are they collecting this data, and if there is anything else we can think out of the box in terms of how it relates to our field in housing and architecture and creating a better environment And honestly, we have a typology here that no one recognizes, which is a shelter typology, which is emergency housing and or a halfway house or, you know, transitional housing before they get into permanent housing. So, and I was happy to hear that Pine Streeton is doing work with Kitty. I think she's no longer here, and sort of recognizing that's a space that needs attention as well as just like a hospital or a clinic or a lab. So, so we are going to focus on data and maybe we can include you in conversations and future conversations and see if you'd like to be involved more. That would be awesome.
I should add that with the Future Lab at Wentworth that I direct, we've got a project with Mahasa where we are taking their data, which, just as you say, Juan, is like very strange and not collected from the same sources and thus has different, you know, inputs and the columns don't work. And I've got students who are cleaning up that data and preparing to visualize it and work through that. So Patrick, I might reach out to you in the future as a guest reviewer, a critic of those students, if you're interested in approaching it from as a guide, right, and an advisor for
Absolutely.
you know, a brief morning sometime. You sound like you really have the know-how based on this certificate and MIT.
I think I've always been interested in data, and I was always kind of like door schedule guy and getting into that. And,
that's a kind of data.
Making sure all that was included, the neglected
That's
areas.
brutal. That's not even data. That's torture. Hardware schedule.
But I mean, the thing is, being on my own for the last 8 years, I'm not exactly sure, you know, what's possible. I'm running, you know, Revit Lite 2016 here, and I can't integrate Grasshopper or Rhino with that or anything like that. So I'm probably like equally unqualified in every area, but we'll see. Samuel, I would love to help. And Joanne, I'd love to catch up with you.
Sure.
At some other point in time, see what's going on.
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn. I probably will find you and friend you. Are you on LinkedIn too?
And I have your page up right now, so
yeah.
Let's see.
Francisco, are you in Lynn, you said?
No, I'm in Somerville. Davis.
Or I was asking friends. I'm in Somerville too,
I'm sorry.
actually. Oh, so Joyce is in Somerville.
Joyce is.
Right there. Cool.
I'm directly behind us. So
I'm by Aeronaut in Somerville. So just to give you
Joyce and I are back over by Ball Square Potterhouse, Davis. Draw a line between us, draw a triangle, and draw the intersection. Right the same about it.
That's a great area. And Francisca, you're in Lynn, is that right?
No, I just have done projects in Lynn. I'm in Cambridge.
Okay.
And Francisca, who do you work with? Are you on your own as well?
Yes, I'm on my own.
Nice.
And actually, you know, I'm a board member of Architects, Designers, and Planners for Social Responsibility. And there are a lot of people there who deal with homelessness, mostly on the West Coast. But it seems like it's such a difficult, I mean, I think it's really a sociological problem that is not so much the homeless issue, but it's the society's issue.
I agree.
Yep. And it needs to be looked at this way. And it would be helpful for architects and designers to understand that and understand really the need, immediate need and long-term need. But that's part of our effort here to unravel the complexity of this.
Right.
And we have Vernon Woodworth on silence, I guess. And the participant.
I'm afraid I should go ahead and step off myself. I think I'm able to, yeah, just leave because Joanne, you're still a host. So
Yeah.
thank y'all for attending. And Alex, is it Alexandra? Alex, which is the preferred?
Either, but I honestly think Alex is less of a mouthful, so that's usually what I expect from people.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll see you in studio.
I was gonna say I'll see you around because you're on the first floor with me, right?
Well,
Don't you?
I'm a TA for Laura.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah.
I'm right next to your studio.
Come hang out. We'll talk about Rural Studio and the Mad Housers in Atlanta who do pop-up shelters. We can powwow about it sometime.
Sounds great. Thank you. I'll sign off as well.
It's good to see you, Vernon.
Hi, Francesca.
Vernon.
Sorry, I stepped away for a moment.
Bye, Sam. Vernon, we're trying to figure out who you are and who you work for, and if you have any more questions before we end our conversation here.
Yeah, so I'm Vernon Woodworth. I teach at the Boston Architectural College, and I also am a code consultant at Fitzmyer and Tachi. And I agree with some previous comments about zoning and building code restrictions, and hopefully that can change, but really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Great. And as I said to everyone who's interested to continue the conversation offline, not to hesitate contacting us. And me and Sam, we're scratching the surface, and some of you are, sitting on a board or, know how to run data or what have you. We would love to engage if you are interested in help us in future conversations with the roundtable.
I do know that, sorry, Francisca. I do know that Mark Margulies is working on a housing for homeless project in Worcester currently.
Yeah, I think we are going to have one of the sessions is talking about what kind of housing is being provided right now, long-term permanent housing, as part of one of the roundtable discussion. And what does that mean to the in-between and to the emergency one? Because it's a range really. And it's I was just saying, it's a typology of its own that we need to recognize and give it its due respect. Okay. Well, if
Thank
no
you
one
for
has
organizing this.
no problem. No problem. Would love to chat more. If nothing else, I think I'm gonna go pop a bottle of wine and have a glass of wine.
Cheers.
Everybody's cool.
Enjoy that.
Okay, great.
I got to cook dinner, so I'm trying to check where my wife is on the way home from downtown. If she hasn't been washed out to sea in the seaport. Off the water needs to go out in the next 5 minutes. So,
okay.
I'll be in touch with you. Nice.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick.
Okay.
Thank you, Vernon.
Sure.
Talk soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.